bit of Ukrainian history today, talking about the Lublin Union of 1569. The defining event in early modern Ukrainian history, properly its beginning chronologically, and a very influential event for the ensuing cultural and historical developments in the region. So, the Lublin Union, taking place within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, saw the transferring of the East Slavic lands of the Union from Lithuania to Poland, that, as you know, were two different entities, right? The Grand Duchy and the Kingdom, two different countries that we have discussed in part when speaking. I made a video last autumn about Lithuania and the broader reasons why at the end of the Middle Ages the connection of this formerly still officially pagan land decided to essentially unite with, to side at least at that point with Poland in the face of the Teutonic onslaught, and thus consolidating over the centuries one of the strongest Central Europe, if not properly the strongest Central European power at that point, but also encompassing, in fact, these eastern lands, right? The other option that was at some point considered by the Lithuanians would have been with the Muscovy, and that decision really changed a big deal in the history of the war. So this is important for Ukrainian history specifically because most of the lands of the Kievan Rus had been historically acquired essentially during the 13th to 14th century by Lithuania. In that video about, in fact, medieval Lithuania, was talking about that it was mostly focused from the 12th to 14th century. Substantially, as you know, after the Mongol invasions, the Kievan Rus cohesion collapsed, and therefore the Lithuanians took advantage of this, expanding what was called probably Ruthenia, were essentially the more civilized lands in the south of Lithuania that was more primitive and warlike, right? And that civilized in process, in fact, the Lithuanian culture. And this was an Eastern European Orthodox reality. It was properly the lands of the Kievan Rus that at this point they had come essentially to be encompassed largely by Lithuanian control, right? It was never an easy land at that point because the collapse of the Kievan Rus was even here, of course, a major event in the history of mankind for the consequences that would bring in the region. So essentially Lithuanians expanded this gap that had been formed in some points, even sharing the Mongol suzerainty on part of the, as you imagine, that the frontier was pretty fluid. Over most of Russia was reduced to vassalage, right? The same reason why Moscow, that up to the 12th century was not even named, like emerged, right, as the most, let's say, obedient ally to the Golden Horde. And we're talking about a very extended area, by the way, as the city of Kiev itself came under Lithuanian domination in 1363. So the Polish-Lithuanian Union brought to this system to largely, be part of this mostly Western shifted area. And these were, by the way, the most civilized areas of the old Rus, right? So much that also the Poles were the strongest among the two had occupied an important part of the Western Rus. King Casimir the Great had essentially seized Galicia and Lviv in 1349. So for roughly 2 centuries, great part of the old Rus, including the lands that now we call Ukraine, right, were divided between Lithuania and Poland. That's simple. Before the Lublin Union between Poland and Lithuania, the latter had occupied, as we've seen, the majority of the old Kievan principalities. Right? But the Rus Palatinate, essentially at that point Poland's Galicia, was also that point the most prosperous, right, and advance of these lands. This was a natural process, not just because it was a kind of a westernmost area, so it was kind of closer to civilization, but also because in the east, of course, the Mongol frontier was, of course, had brought to a process of statal decay, etc., and fragmentation. This is and also had properly injected in most of what we consider Russian culture today, and that's what we were mentioning Moscow before. This very different mentality compared to the old Rus. There was somewhat balance from a political institutional point of view, because it was a princely rule, but also a sound middle class, making Russia essentially transition into the autocratic form that was essentially a perfect copy of the Mongol models, of the conquerors of the steppes. We also made a video about late medieval Russian cavalry, and seen there doesn't even make sense to distinguish it in arms and armor from essentially from a Mongol one. And this is no exaggeration. This is exactly what it is in practice. And we also made lots of videos about this. I created a medieval Russia playlist, so if you're interested, you can check that out, because I explain in depth how the thing happened. This is not to say that the Russians were Mongols or anything. I'm not doing it for ideological reasons, but literally because we tend to underestimate the impact of Mongol, properly of this autocratic, seigneurial, oligarchic mentality that was typical of also eventually Russian expansionism and imperialism, in ways that were not quite there westwards, where the concepts properly of of consensual government were way more developed since a longer time, and would keep developing along that pattern. For the time, standards being definitely a Western thing, was unknown practically by the same degree in the rest of the world. In any case, Poland was the strongest between the two in the Union, of course, and also controlled, as we've seen, the most advanced of the former old Rus lands, even though the Lithuanians had the largest extensional control. So, in many ways, the 1569 union between Poland and Lithuania was also a repartition, essentially, of the old Rus lands on terms that were favorable to Poland. Lithuania essentially retained the more northerly Slavic territories, known as Belarus, that historically had not been so developed like the south. Also, Lithuania ceded to Poland its mostly southerly territories. So we're talking about Bratslav, Kiev, and Volyn, that would become thus historically Braslav, Kijów, and Woli in Polish. So we're looking at what is today is what we call Ukraine. That we'll explain now in a while in its terminology. Orthodox nobles of Rus, who after 200 years at this point had fundamentally been integrated within the Lithuanian Grand Duchy, now found themselves within the Polish kingdom. was a big change, because Lithuania historically had maintained essentially more of an Eastern European rather than a Polish Central European outlook, right? The Lithuanians had boyars, had a much more privatistic mentality. It was kind of closer in this sense to the Russian one, and that was historically determined. In fact, also properly, even within those lands that remain under Lithuanian control, by the degree of ferocious privatization and autocratization of power. So it was essentially oligarchs ruling feudally, right? Poland worked like that too, but it still kind of was kind of a more urbanized area, was kind of closer to major international routes, it was more Western in nature. A major difference was banally evident in religion. Galicia was Orthodox, right? It used Ruthenian vernacular, and its liturgical language was the Church Slavonic. The script was Cyrillic, right? So something very different from Poland. That was a Catholic country, spoke Polish, and the liturgical language was Latin. Script was in fact Latin. So imagine suddenly that Kiev itself, the capital of the Rus, suddenly became Poland, Belgium. So the became Poland properly as part of the kingdom. So the Lublin Union between the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Polish kingdom was the product of a long historical process, right? It was negotiated. There were naturally much that the Lithuanian nobility had wanted to secure, to control, and at this point the disparity, right, of forces was evident. But when we speak specifically of the absorption of the area of Ukraine by Poland, was hasty and unnegotiated. The difference with Lithuania were also important, still from a cultural point of view, because, as we were saying before, and famously enough, Lithuania remained pagan formally until 1386, where his first ruler baptized, but also for the next 2 centuries at least the Lithuanian customs and practice were not particularly different. In any case, the situation in Ukraine was very different, because, as we've seen, this was an Orthodox land, and essentially the land from which the entire Eastern Europe had been evangelized, was properly the spiritual center of Orthodoxy after at least in a free sense, given that Constantinople had fallen under the Ottomans, but was still, of course, maintaining its patriarchy over as a spiritual as a charisma properly over the Orthodox Church. But these were the old lands of the Rus, from which, in fact, the great missions in Eastern Europe had started from. This important Orthodox culture and civilization had spread right to the rest of Russia, and naturally the Mongol invasion had changed a big deal, right? As you know, the center of the Russian center of power shifted to other areas. Even various bishoprics were to claim a metropolitic authority, but this was something very different, but much more political in nature than had been before, because that was essentially a struggle between a fragmented Russia as a Mongol vassal state to fundamentally play within itself, to competition among the various principalities for these titles were fought over and bought, etc. But there was something spiritual about the old Rus that was part properly of Kiev, first of all. and that as such was maintained in Ukraine. The integration of Ukraine in a Catholic kingdom highlighted ever more the paradox of the situation in Eastern Europe. And we're talking about 1569. So Western Christendom as a united church didn't properly exist anymore. So the reform had brought Reformation, Counter-Reformation, an important lot of consequences in properly in the means of spreading ideas, and this Eastern European reality had been in large part because of its in part of what properly was connected to Orthodox traditionalism, right? As we've seen also in the videos about the Byzantine Empire and the broader decline on in the face of the Ottoman onslaught and so on. So a world was truly different, right, at a deeper level, and that thus had, say, was in a sense destined to see its culture declining in front of the means that were being developed in the West, but at the same time was retaining its uniqueness, and still within, a system that was quite controversially divided. At this point in Poland, it was still a Catholic country, but for example, it was a substantial Calvinist minority. Eventually that would end, but still, the political problems that St. Paul's were facing internally were something that now the old Russians had to also to put themselves in relation with politically, and naturally not with a dramatic negotiable power, also considering in fact what were the neighboring countries at that point, the risks at this point the Ottomans posed, but the same in fact of their Mongol allies are the same Russians at that point. So as we were saying before, in medieval times, the Orthodox Lithuanian churchmen had provided Vilnius and Lithuania with East Slavic languages and culture, had been a triumph, right, of acculturation from the old Rus areas of the south towards the north. The Poles at this point, however, had by this point had come to dominate over Lithuania herself, so that the Lithuanian nobility was forced, as we've seen, to grant Ukraine to Poland, and the area was engineered by the new rulers, and so the area of Ukraine had properly spread in Lithuania Christianity, writing. Ukraine now received from early modern Poland a modern Christianity, the printed book, right? Think about properly the different scale of ideas, transmission of probably the cultural models and so on. And 1569 thus marks a very important date in Eastern Europe, because this cultural flow between the lands of the old Rus and Lithuania somewhat was stopped, right, or at least came to be under the dramatic influence of Catholicism of Poland, and this marks properly, in this sense, the beginning of the Ukrainian early modernity, right? In lands that, yes, in many ways had remained within the mental frameworks of the of medieval universality, that up to that point had properly been possible to even think, because the Orthodox had just seen the Orthodox there and nothing else. So much had happened. Constantinople had fallen. The world had not ended. lots of things had been going on in the same lands of the Rus, quite dramatic ones, and so in a way actually Poland preserved Ukraine in many ways, but still it brought now to a much more, let's say, to an unavoidable presence of an external culture that, in order to control the area, to compete also with the neighbors that intended to expand in there, it was a quite delicate situation internationally, had to somewhat change the reality on locally. So there is also later on in Ukrainian national poetry the realization that the new great center of the old Rus had been Vilnius, had been Lithuanian, that historically was not Rus properly, but that in this way had been seen by the Ruthenians as fundamentally the greatest success of of the Rus itself and Orthodoxy itself, so much that Taras Shevchenko, the very famous Ukrainian poet, would say of Vilnius, the most glorious of cities, right? So more than in Kiev, conceptually. This mentality was stemming from the realization that Ukraine, by that point in the 19th century, was unavoidably connected to Warsaw instead. And which was naturally an important political realization as well. So there was a deep semantic there, properly in the obvious conversions that began at that point among the Ukrainian nobility to Catholicism after the Lublin Union. Because fundamentally this had marked, in 1569, the end of a religious historical continuity that dated back to the Orthodox baptism of the Grand Duke Vladimir in 988, that had marked properly the beginning of the history of the Rus in Kiev. An era changed forever. So, as we were saying before, looking at mid 16th century Poland, we see there were Catholics, Protestants, bringing and competing among each other, and so showing this conflict to Ukrainians, bringing the printed word vernacular, which was yet another important dimension of modernity at that point, whereas medieval times it was just either Latin, or in this other context Old Slavonic, right? So they were languages that, of course, were not really spoken anymore by the people already, but that were still the languages of a living civilization in the respective regions, because people used properly to speak and write and etc. in these languages. So this was yet another boundary that was broken. Properly, the techniques of disputation revived by the Renaissance, probably a different philological method, a new way of thinking in the first place, were introduced in Ukraine after 1569. The main agents of this were the Jesuits, that were naturally securing at that point the Catholic orthodoxy in this in a land that was already not Catholic, and that could also witness the spread of Protestantism by a certain manner, and especially in maybe weaponizing it in an anti-Polish, anti-Catholic fashion, of course. So there was, of course, bitterness in all this, because it was obvious that such external influence would bring to the decline of what the Orthodox culture had been in Ukraine, which in fact began to decline unavoidably. Also, as a country that at that point was losing and had already lost fundamentally negotiable power, as we have seen in the Union had already witnessed. And the disparity was inherent in the same cultural models that Old Church Slavonic possessed at that point. In high medieval times, this was the language that substantially had evangelized not just the Eastern, but also the Southern Slavs. And that had been accomplished by winning these people to Christianity, right? The pagan counter-altar didn't have really anything competitive to offer in that sense. So gradually, however, those people had been controlled mostly by the church and the nobility attached in areas of Europe that historically didn't have much of a dramatic urban development, were sparsely populated, a few communications, and part of the reason also why they had gradually decayed, either from an Eastern or because of an Eastern or Western pounding, fundamentally, how if you can look at the thing in perspective. The Mongol invasion and the transformation of these lands, in fact, in real frontiers, as the same name of Ukraine, in fact, means. Also, vernacular of early modern Ukraine was naturally very different from the Old Church Slavonic, was something very different. So, in front of the Protestant and Catholic literature, right, the one of the Orthodox Church was simply dwarfed, right, and properly the means of communication within the Orthodox Church were different, right. There was an attempt by the same Protestants and Catholics in Ukraine to use the same Church Slavonic in their Ukrainian schools and publications, because they thought, if we write in their, at least in their language, at least in their ecclesiastical language, they would be more receptive. But this was also a miscalculation, because as a matter of fact, this already didn't have this language didn't have a grip on the people that spoke another one. It was habituated to communicate differently, so that on the long run, Polish prevailed, right? So these areas historically had been also, the boundaries had been floating. So that historically the southeastern parts of, in fact, these ones of the Polish kingdom were brought to an obvious merging and blurring of Polish and Ukrainian, just even the same communities living in the same places fundamentally together in the frontier areas, and they which was a process also due to sort of Polonization, say, of part, at least, of Ukrainian culture, especially in the western part, and all the attritions that stem from that, of course, historically. But of course, Polish, from the local perspective, was kind of, an advanced language of culture, right? It was viable for propaganda, for proselytism. So the same Ukrainians didn't actually oppose this, because they didn't see much of a problem even in relation to their national prejudice of the interests of the local, the local nobility, local gentry. On the contrary, it was, accepted exactly because it could interact more with the Polish. It could help them interacting better with the Polish authority. There was, however, some kind of Church Slavonic proponents revival, let's say, important figures that even opposed, in fact, politically to the Union, such as Konstantin Ostroz'kyi, that was the most powerful of the Volhynian princes. You know, Volhynia is fundamentally would be today's northwestern Ukraine. It's basically north of Lviv and across also Poland, part of Belarus, where also historically some of the greatest ethnic violence actually broke out as a borderland. Well, this prince sponsored the publication of the first complete Bible in Church Slavonic. Also, it was Pavel Berinda that published a lexicon. It was a theologian instead, and also Petr Moila, who founded an Orthodox collegium, which would later become Kiev Academy. So, this used Church Slavonic, albeit the textbooks would unavoidably be in Latin most of the time, and in fact the composition generally in Polish. So this was kind of natural for another reason. If you wanted to learn other languages, classical rhetoric and disputation, the Church Slavonic texts wouldn't provide you with that. You see, the Renaissance had, throughout all the Middle Ages, Latin in the West had, of course, remained in contact with the same classical Latin. So also with rhetoric, with all the historiographical work, with the theological debate, because they had been written in Latin. So there was a continuity in that, and Latin remained equipped with those, generally speaking, even those models, that mindset, that frame. The same goes for Greek, that was revived partially, in fact, in the Renaissance, next to Latin, for broadly speaking, among the scholars, the men of culture, and so on. Church Slavonic didn't quite have this, because Church Slavonic was not a classical language. It had been used, in fact, just because it was created as a written language from the one spoken among the Slavs, that of course didn't have essentially any classical culture, not even literacy for that matter. So the models of Church Slavonic texts were not essentially didn't have properly the same capacities of integrating those those tools necessary for rhetoric, disputation, that instead the Latin texts of now the local rulers were just providing them with. So it would have been much easier just to learn Latin in the process. What, let's say, the Church Slavonic textual anachronism was very much appreciated by was instead in Moscow, that at this point was recovering, in fact, the idea of the legacy of the old Rus and the Tsars of old Rus, in fact, in all these things, and were, of course, Orthodox, and so they kept having, of course, contacts with Kiev, with Ukraine, and some of these, let's say, Church Slavonic scholars were sold after by the Muscovites because of that older bond, and so this tells you also what Muscovite culture was at that point, as opposed to the Polish-Lithuanian one at the same time. So the same use of Polish, after all, was accepted in literature by Ukrainians for the same reasons, right? In fact, at the beginning of the 17th century, the majority of polemical tracts written by Orthodox churchmen in Ukraine were in Polish, albeit by tradition the titles, the pseudonyms, and other specific terms that quite have in their an evident semantic power were often properly Byzantine, still in at least in origin. Also, let's say starting from the 20s, Orthodox churchmen in Ukraine began to sign their names in Polish. After the 40s, most official documents in Ukraine were written in Polish. The same aforementioned Mohila, who died in 1647, wrote his will in Polish. So this makes you understand how Ukrainians were already, accepting the fact that, Polish was a necessity, and that after all, it was still, of course, Western and Eastern Slavic languages differ, but there is also some sort of proximity. So this is also partly understandable in the same Slavic roots by some degree. So one important response in this sense from the Orthodox hierarchy was to seek a direct connection with the Vatican, which was quite important, had been so even in previous times. The same conversion of the Lithuanians had taken that character. The Teutonic waging crusades on behalf of the Pope in the land were essentially stopped by Lithuanian conversion, which was just a way for the Lithuanians to say, if we convert to Catholicism, we seek papal approval. The Pope naturally has to gain from this because it can divide the various and control the various Catholic countries in a way that nobody kind of supersedes the other. And so this idea of having a direct link of fil rouge with Rome was fundamental. And of course, the card to play there, given that this was an Orthodox church, was to resume the papal projects of union. Right, Rome, after the Great Schism of 1054, had always sought properly the recomposition of the church, naturally under the papacy itself. This, as you know, was essentially proposed and actually formally accepted also by the Byzantine government, whereas the people never did, so much that in a way Constantinople fell because simply the Orthodox accepted Islam better than Catholicism, but which is in insight was not really a good decision for them, and not just for them, but not really talking about even here in ideological sense, but properly in insight of what politically this would mean. As we will see now, also with the Patriarch of Constantinople, what was happening to him in the meanwhile. And because at least under a Catholic government, a Catholic rule, that there would have been some sort of integration in a broader Western development. That's most of the reason. It's not even just a matter of of religion, of Islam. After all, that's why the same Constantinopolitans opted for that, because they understood the centrality that the city would have maintained. After all, the sultans who made of it a great capital, European capital once again. But of course, with much else going on in the broader cultural area, in a broad sense. Anyhow, what happened with 1569 is that such local union with Rome could operate. After all, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at this point was a Catholic country, so a broader process of Catholicization would have happened again. But again, the direct connection with the Vatican would have been much more advantageous for Ukrainians in the first place. So this happened in a context that was pretty stormy in the old Rus lands. So the separation of the metropolitic sees of Moscow and Kiev had been established in 1458. There had been a ferocious competition. The metropolitic seat had been shifted to Vladimir, then it was essentially bought by Moscow. And as you understand now, probably the fact that Kiev was within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had brought now also a powerful card to play there in an anti-Muscovite fashion, because if you have an Orthodox metropolitic sit within your boundaries, you can't really play along that. It was also, as we've seen with this video, properly a Polish business now, not a Lithuanian one, because Ukraine was Kingdom of Poland now. And by the way, that was also an advantageous thing, because Lithuania also was not faring that better, let's say, being part of the bigger one that also that is in contrast with Russia, etc. It doesn't, it gets a greater protection after all, for a country that, however, is not going to be independent anyway at that point. So there was a ferocious hatred, as you understand, was going on because of these split of the older metropolitic order of the Rus. So the Jesuits also worked here for the union with the Orthodox. For example, the Polish Piotr Skarga, that was kind of an important figure. He also participated to negotiations between Poland, Russia, etc. He lived between 1536 and 1612. There were also papal emissaries such as Antonio Posavino that illustrated the Vatican the possibility of a regional union with Ukraine. Also, the Polish King Zygmunt III Vasa was quite positive towards probably securing a unity on religious grounds that was, of course, a broader consolidation of the Commonwealth's monarchic power that, as you know, historically had quite lots of problems with the centrifugal pushes of the oligarchy. So it's obvious that this union was played still within a Roman Polish system within which Ukraine was in the first place. So in 1596 came the Brest Union, which was essentially the effort of the Orthodox Episcopal hierarchy to preserve the existence of their church, right? Even if at the conditions of the Catholics. And at this point, the international situation was tense because the Orthodox Patriarchy of Constantinople still, in theory, regarded its own primacy over the Eastern Christendom, but it had suffered severe blows, not just because of the fact that it depended now on the Ottomans, but also because of the pressure that had been put at the same moment. The Patriarchy of Moscow was just established with very dubious methods that had been possible just because the Tsars had managed to secure control of important parts of Russia and expanding their own empire further. Jeremiah II was Patriarch of Constantinople at the time, had been imprisoned by both the Ottomans and the Muscovites, by the way. So this shows how, also considering that he spent some time in Poland's Ukraine in 1588, 1589, how, let's say, there was kind of a closer contact, paradoxically, with Catholics at that point from the side of the Constantinopolitan Patriarchy than with of course, the Ottomans, it's, at least in the sense that they were the masters there, but also with the same Orthodox Muscovites that were seeing the institution fundamentally emptied of the meaning just for their own interest. So Jeremiah ordered the annual synods at Brest, where he thought better that suited than other localities, to work a deal of union between the Orthodox and Catholic churches, as it happened in fact in 1596. And there was naturally, things didn't go smoothly anyway, because from the Polish side there was an obvious attempt with the Brest Union to dispense completely at that point of the Orthodox Church. It was in their own interest, and the Orthodox at that point had seen the union mostly as we've just explained, as the opportunity to gain a greater weight by being part of a larger power, and to be properly institutionalized within it, and so to have some greater weight also international for their own cause. The Vatican treated this union, of course, its own way. It was still a way to control Polish policy from the within, but also, broadly speaking, to end in schism in favor of consolidation of Catholicism in Europe in very dramatic times because of the Reformation and everything. But it wasn't a full exploitation either, right? The Poles could not afford that. King Sigmund the Third claimed rightfully that he was bound, of course, to protect the united church that had begun, because that the possibility of getting Orthodox support to the Catholic cause against the Protestants that now had fundamentally shrunk in the 30 years from the Lublin Union already, was still an investment for the stability of the Commonwealth that was was a gigantic and quite complex thing to manage, and therefore didn't have quite an interest to intimidate himself properly the Ukrainians at that point for any purpose. And paradoxically, the Protestants themselves, being forced to cooperate not just with the Catholics, now were reinforced by the Union, but with the Orthodox themselves, paradoxically they sided more with the Orthodox, because at that point, of course, they had in common that they were not Catholic, and so in a way, still accepting the Orthodox presence within the Polish kingdom was a way to secure part of their own confessional survival in the same country. And naturally, there were some, these were quite stormy times in the first place, and especially in the Commonwealth, considering the inherent nature of the Schlachta, of these oligarchs fundamentally ruled the system together with a monarchy that struggled to impose itself, to create something more concentrated in power, that on the longer run, centuries long, would fail, but at this point was probably at the top of its power, were given troubles in a way. In fact, the aforementioned Constantine Ostroz'kyi that we have seen before was firmly opposed to the Brest Union. As the most powerful Ukrainian magnate, specifically a Volhynian prince, he had published the Slavonic Bible, as we were saying before, and had taken arms. Right, at this point, the oligarchs in the Commonwealth were mostly that they all had their private armies, right, including artillery, everything. The East was more influential. We made videos about the Polish-Lithuanian army. I also created a playlist. We will keep updating that, so if you're interested, you can look at that. There's these references. So, of course, the East was a bit wilder. and it's quite fascinating to see. But at that point, men as Ostroz'kyi were equipped with also the same Protestant rhetoric, that the Pope was an antichrist among the the varied ones. So that was a favorite one, given that basically the Protestants in Europe were supporting the Ottomans against the Papacy, for that matter, and the Habsburgs, etc. This time in the age of print, and so protesting against not just the Union but the Commonwealth altogether. And Ostroz'kyi managed to put in the field some nobles from properly the Volyn and Kiev areas, through some local parliaments to protest the Brest Union. Thus, it's fair to say that it was this religious dispute that somewhat was blending in the Catholic-Protestant struggle that paradoxically managed to bring the Orthodox Ukrainian nobility into a larger game, right? To politics of the Commonwealth, and thus of something of European in scale. If we look at the perspective from the Ukrainian gentry, like the Orthodox town folk, etc., we see the Brest Union as naturally a threat to their interests, in as much as Polish immigration, for example, represented somewhat a competitive entity in their own affairs. And in the parishes, the United Church failed to properly unify the Orthodox clergy and to, let's say, show that the deal was fundamentally advantageous for the majority. And this controversy also brought a new dialectic within the same Ukraine to be stimulated, right? So much that another change of enormous importance occurred when the secular and sacred and traditional designation of Rus was sided, at least, with this term that is essentially strategic. It's properly military in nature, because it reflected the mobilization of these oligarchic retinues, and so properly the idea that also the eastern frontier was something a bit more trouble. So independently also from these matters, as with the term Ukraina, the Kraina. In Slavic language, there are many Krainas, right? There was one, for example, at the boundary between Austria and the Ottoman Empire, was known as the Kraina. There are many Krainas. This was the Kraina. So, what that the Ukraine means, and that also would open some questions, but we don't have time in this video, at least, to explain, because you understand that the name of Rus was the traditional one, right? So, today, of course, we speak of Russia, of Ukraine, so we have, really a lot of water passed under the bridges, but we're talking here something that in historical insight today we didn't address properly what was the legacy of the Kievan Rus, or who could claim it, right? Because it's naturally a very inflammatory topic. Because again, Kiev was controlling hegemonizing the principality when Moscow didn't even exist in the historical sources. So, of course, much had changed also up to this point in early modern times, and this was evident. as the Muscovites fundamentally were already a power of some consistency for Western standards, and Ukraine here was essentially a province of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but there was still properly the emergence within this system of the realization that something Ukrainian did exist after all, right? What would develop further into properly the full-fledged national identity was perceived on the base. It's overlappable, right? It's it can't really be, we could start talking of how even properly a Ukrainian national awareness was born, right? But this is a trick that many people use to disconfess some national identities. Also in other countries, this happens also here in Western Europe. Like when were countries born? And there's a lot of inflammatory rhetoric naturally deriving from nationalistic arguments and counter arguments to say, until this country formally did not exist as a political unity, there was no such thing like a national identity, which is paradoxical, especially considering certain realities. I mean, Italy or Germany. I mean, these were countries that, yes, did have cultures that were fundamentally still, taking form in different political realities, but that were born before, in fact, the unified nation that happened as a, consequential process by some kind. Cannot be ignored, right? And so these are subtle things that must be understood from a solid historical standpoint, which I presume most people absolutely don't have, because properly they're not sensitized to the indicators of this. And sometimes it's not even about a subtlety. This is sometimes realizing that we're, already cultural superpowers that for this reason didn't need to have a political unity for that matter either. So what is very important here is that Ukraine was starting to be recognized linguistically also in something like a political meaning, properly as a homeland of the Orthodox within Poland, which is not a few for the times, because of the importance of the Commonwealth and of Poland within it, of course. It's important because it looks at an area that, the Commonwealth was huge. And in fact, it arrived until Kiev, right? And if you look at the southern eastern lands, there are, were somewhat basically more Tatar controlled. Also the, historically, the emergence of these were already there, the Cossacks, etc., that even in there were not the Kazakhs were anymore, at least. This, as you know, was taken on by actually Slavic people living there, but assuming that kind of lifestyle. So Ukrainian national identity is complex, but it's there, right? And it's there, can be observed this early on, and arguably much earlier on, because there is a direct connection with the Old Rus, as we explained today, that brought to this very realization, to the birth, in fact, of the necessity of calling that area in a way that would be, in fact, the frontier, Ukraine, demonstrates by itself. So this is really important from a historical point of view. And it's important to stress that this thing happened within Poland, because as we've seen, the Orthodox existed also in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. These were other Eastern Slavs that would eventually have another story and another identity. But even in there, it's, in fact, the legacy of the Rus is quite complex to break down, right? But there is still no doubt that, culturally speaking, whatever had pertained to that originated mostly in today's Ukrainian territory. And that there is a whole load of continuity, culturally, linguistically, ethnically, in a broader sense. That there is, again, no historical doubt, unless, there are all the various versions, right, that historiographically were there. There is the Ukrainian version, there's the Polish version, there is a Russian version, there are the Soviet version, they are all different. But to be realistic, and this is not just because of 1569, 1596. This is, of course, much what would happen later, and that we will hopefully cover. Ukraine is not an opinion, and so the Brest Union, especially as a properly in 1596 as a reaction for its consequences to the same union, shows the local concern for their own prerogatives and their own struggle, literally in arms. So paradoxically, the Brest Union posed a problem, right? At the moment was mirroring, of course, some sort of let's say cohesion in the Commonwealth, but at the same time it was just by validating the Orthodox presence, recognizing it, and in this sense, let's say fueling its consistency within the political balance. That because it was formalized, was legitimized, right, and they couldn't do otherwise, by the way, if they wanted to control the area in the first place. So the matter would be also problematic for other reasons, because of course we have talked about oligarchs, and these Eastern European lands were, as we were saying before, quite at this point, especially these areas, especially Galicia, were developed, right, for those time standards, but still they were, characteristically Eastern European, and mostly the gap between the intelligentsia, let's say, and also the oligarchy that backed it, etc., and the peasants was widening, because of course the peasants, had they been interested in these ideological questions, ignored completely in Ukraine what the hell the reform and the union were, right? And so that's another thing that will play, an important social factor eventually in Ukrainian history later on. And this, however, is part of the broader political balances and mechanisms that exist always for reasons that are overly complicated to explain just in a single video, relatively to foreign domestic policy. But for today, I wanted just to show the importance that the Lublin and Brest unions meant, and we'll keep talking about Ukrainian history soon.